Welcome back to Season 6 of the Group Practice Accelerator podcast, brought to you by Polaris Healthcare Partners, where we leverage decades of healthcare and business experience to drive growth in successful group practices just like yours. If you're a healthcare entrepreneur and you're interested in building, scaling, or exiting your group practice, you've found not only the industry's leading resource for business education, but a team of trusted advisors dedicated to helping you achieve and exceed your goals. In short, the team at Polaris creates clarity, confidence, and results. I'm your host, Jamie Falasz, and the Group Practice Accelerator podcast is on the air. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again this week, because on the heels of the 4th of July, we're going to be talking about freedom. No, I'm not talking about Mel Gibson on horseback with blue face paint. I'm talking about your personal freedom. And what does that mean really in the context of this show? So, as a founder, you've built a business that you can be proud of, but it's probably a safe bet that you haven't built a business you can take a vacation from. Can you take 2 weeks away and not feel the weight of your absence in the numbers at the end of the month? Does the business need you to operate without a hit to revenue? And for most founders, that answer is sadly yes. The business needs your physical presence and clinical production to continue on its current financial track. But is that what you really want? Is that why you went into business for yourself? I think I know the answer to that already. So you could be indefinitely tied to it without the ability to really shut down and enjoy time away with family and friends, or without the ability to make a shift in order to work on the business instead of in it. I'm sure that's not what you had in mind when you set out, and you deserve to be in a place that allows you to choose to shift into CEO if you choose to take a few weeks away without the bus careening off a financial cliff. So today, we want to help you examine your own state of freedom and then provide you with some initial steps to make a change while you grow and stabilize your business. Because really, what we're talking about is a solid, stable foundation again, aren't we? And that's the key that really unlocks your personal freedom. And to help us walk through how to achieve this is Polaris founder and CEO, Diwakar Sinha. Hey, Diwakar, welcome back.
Hey, Jamie, thanks for having me again.
Well, in talking about personal freedom and taking time away from the business, I'm going to start with you because you take time away. How do you do that as a founder, as the principal of the business?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I have a great team. My team allows me to have that freedom, right? But the steps were, implemented early on, in it. So I think early on, I looked at the business two ways. And neither are wrong. I looked at saying, okay, where do I want to take the business? And I think that's where a lot of founders and listeners on this podcast need to be thinking about. There's two types of businesses. A type of business where the principal is the operator of the business and they operate in the business and just is the business is dependent on them. And you see a lot of small businesses that are out there that operate that way. And yes, it in some cases it results in more income to the founder because there's a philosophy: keep it all, keep it small. Right. I
Yeah.
think people have probably heard that saying out there. When Polaris was created, we looked at it and said, okay, we want to make a business that scales and allows freedom, not just financial freedom, but freedom to go and allow team members to go on vacation and other team members can support it. Allows me to go on vacation and, the business runs independent of me. Right. And I think that's what, founders need to be thinking about, and even executive team members need to be thinking about, is how is the business scaling today and where's the business going to be? And if the founder goes on vacation for 4 days and they are 10% or 50% of the production of the practice, is that closing down rescheduling patients? Is that down production days? And how expensive is that to the practice? I was in a conference a couple of years ago on the West Coast, and there was a lot of 2 to 4 location practices where a lot of founders felt that if they went on vacation and it was going to cost them an extra $50,000 to go on vacation. And that's inclusive of down production, paying their staff their wages, and obviously including their own, vacation costs. So, I think that's a heavy burden for a founder to feel as they're, one, thinking about taking vacation with their family, and also how that impacts practice.
Yeah, and this really it was not a fishing expedition for compliments, but we do have a great team here, and when one person's out, we've made sure operationally that someone else can pick up those responsibilities so that we operate seamlessly, and really that's what we want for our listeners too. We want you to be able to shut down or make a different choice or whatever that might be and let your business continue and not just continue, but to thrive and to grow. So what I'm really getting at here is just ask yourself, do you have personal freedom? And do you really have it if you can't take a vacation or you can't step away? And how does that feel, most importantly? Because what do you really have if you don't have that personal freedom? So ask yourself and sit with it for just a minute. How does it make you feel? Maybe you feel trapped, frustrated, hopeless. Are you afraid to let go? And what do all those things have in common? It's you as a founder not getting the life that you want. So, Diwakar and I want to talk through this, help you change that by building an operationally sound and healthy business so that you can take that time away and make some different choices. So, that's a long winded way of saying, let's get started by asking some questions around what can help you get there. And then we'll talk through some steps. So, first, is it safe to make some assumptions that maybe we'll start with 2 to 3 locations, it grows about 5 to 10 million in revenue with a 15% EBITDA. Is that a good place to start?
Sure. And I think, on the lower end, it'd be 12%, but usually 15% is a good number. Yep.
Okay. So, first, maybe should someone ask, maybe where am I today and how does that look? How do I get a look at where I am in terms of is it a number? Is it a benchmark? How do I establish where I am today?
Yeah, I think I was encouraged, and I do this myself. I always look at it and say, okay, what did I intend the business to be? Okay. I think I would encourage every person on this call to ask that question. And where's the business today? So, are we on track? Are we off track? Okay. And there's nothing wrong with the vision of the business evolving, right? I mean, times evolve, market conditions evolve. We see new opportunities in this space. So I don't look at those things as a negative. I see that, okay, let's make sure we're still adhering to the core of what we built the business for, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's important to say, okay, if we're at 3 locations, and let's say the business revenue is $6 million, okay, what does our profitability look like? What is our net income? What is our cash and balance sheet? And does that feel okay? Right. Number one, I think that you just have to say, okay, that feels a good spot. And if it doesn't, what are we missing there? Okay. And could they exit the business? And when I say exit the business, I'm not talking about transaction
Mhm.
currently. We'll get to that later. Could they exit the business, go on vacation for 2 weeks to the south of France, enjoy life, right? And their phone doesn't ring, right?
Mhm.
And the business maintain that $500,000 monthly revenue for the next, 2 weeks with a run rate and without a hiccup, right? And more importantly, the expenses stay in line, right? I mean, it's not like people are ordering more and wage expenses are going out of line. So all those things are in cadence to what I want to be. And I think that's where people need to say, okay, am I where I want it to be? And from there, can I grow it to where I want to be? And where am I going? And, I was talking to somebody earlier today, and one of the things they had not defined a year ago that they defined recently is where they wanted to go. And that
Oh,
was a really good and enlightening moment for them because they just kept on, just adding operatories, adding locations, and had this aha moment. Okay, I'm just adding stuff to add stuff. And
yeah.
then had, internal review to realize, okay, this is what I built. I'm actually very happy with what I built, but this is actually where I'm trying to go. And this is the decisions we need to make differently moving forward to where we're trying to go. And I think that's some of the things that people need to be thinking about on the podcast.
I agree, and I'll say that yeah, we do run across people like that that are just they're adding ops or adding locations, but they're not necessarily adding value. So that I think has to roll into the where am I now and where do I really want to go? So if we take that where am I now and we have established that okay, we need to make some changes in the business in order for me to step away. But like you said, whether that's an exit for a vacation or exit to exit. Where do I need to be to have independence? How do I determine that?
Yeah, so I think first of all, it's going to be by clinical specialty. It's going to be different aspects mathematically, right? Because I think there's compensation aspects of it, and there's also specialization. If you specialize in a procedure that none of your other doctors do within your practice, then that process is a little bit different because now you have to scale that clinical procedure within your practice across the platform, right? Simple as a unique one would be sedation, right? If you're the only sedation doctor in your practice and you have two other general dentists and you want to scale yourself back a little bit, then those two doctors have to understand sedation dentistry, or at least one of the other doctors has to understand sedation dentistry. So one's more on the clinical side is going to be ability to clinically replace yourself for specialized procedures. But it's somewhat connected to that is the ability for the other providers to clinically replace you. Okay,
Mhm.
that's one. So if you produce, in most cases, founders tend to be not the highest, I would say. I would think that'd be a very strong position, but the higher producing doctors within a dental practice or dental group. They're going to be in the top 10%, if not the higher side of it. So, if they're producing $1 million or 1.5 million within the practice, are there other doctors that can fill the shoe within the practice? And then two, can they bring on another doctor to replace them in the practice?
Yeah.
So if they're, making 1.5 million, they're walking away from about a $500,000 in income, you know? So that can't happen overnight necessarily. So you have to now think about it and say, okay, what does the practice have to grow in revenue to make up that EBITDA to get that $500,000 back to the principal? Right? So if they're producing $1 million, let's use that. That's about $300,000 at a 30% for a general dentist. Okay. So now we look at the $6 million revenue practice and say, okay, if that practice is doing 15% margin, that's $450,000. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, $750,000. Now we need to grow that practice to about $9 million in revenue. Okay. And still maintain that 15% margin.
Okay.
Okay. And over time, we can now see that practice maintaining that EBITDA margin because at 900,000 at a 15% margin, that practice will do, roughly around a 1,250,000 on the EBITDA.
Yeah, makes sense. So, the next couple of things that I was thinking about that founders should ask themselves, I'm going to roll the next two together. It's should I exit or not? Because obviously you've got to be operationally optimized for that to happen. And then should I exit or not? And then what's on the horizon so I can enjoy my life in the meantime? Because really, if we're asking that, should I exit or not, we're looking at probably 5 years down the road on your horizon line.
Yeah. What I always tell people is if you cannot exit a business, you do not have freedom, right? Even if you're so there's two components of freedom we're talking about. One is the ability to go vacation, which I think as you scale and you put in systems and processes in place, you replace yourself clinically within the practice and you can improve margins within the practice. Now you can create improvement EBITDA, pay yourself a salary and replace yourself in income, right? I think that's great, right? And then we also obviously I would highly recommend some kind of a partnership track for doctors that allow them to realize some of the upside as they're growing and provides them the same security you're getting. Now
Yeah.
they want security that they're building something that they get to participate in. You want security that you're building something that you can go on vacation of, you have financial freedom from. So I think that's a win-win, right, in that aspect.
Mhm.
So now we get to that. You built this $9, $10 million revenue practice. So you're on track to continue to grow. How do you exit that business? you know and if you cannot exit that business, then you're tied to that business,
Right.
right? So I think it's important to think about what does exit look like for you. And a lot of people will say, well, when I want to exit, I want to walk away in a year to 2 years. Well, that depends on what kind of valuation you're looking for, how the deal is going to be structured. So I think it's very important for people to start thinking about the business they're building, who the potential buyer is going to be upfront, okay? And it's okay if it's gonna be their associates in an internal transaction because that's okay. It's gonna be a discounted valuation or a lower valuation, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're not discouraging that. I think people just need to be, prepared for that. But if they're thinking of exiting to a third party and allowing an economic windfall for their associates and for themselves, that needs to be planned 5 to 7 years out, before transacting, because in most structures, the principal, even if they're clinically out of the shares, they're going to be looking at some kind of a rollover equity and some kind of a post transaction agreement.
Yeah, that's exactly where my mind went when you said exit in 1 to 2 years. I mean, truly, how does a buyer view that? That's not gonna look so great in the eyes of a buyer if your business isn't optimized or you don't have partners to stabilize the business when you're away from it. So, yeah, looking at that from a buyer's lens, you kind of have to do both when you're looking out at that horizon of, what's my next 5 years look like? And 1 to 2 years is not necessarily the most realistic as we've talked about before with that type of transaction. I said excluding doctor to doctor or internal sale. Uh,
Yeah, and I'll say, Jamie, that I'm just doing an article on this. I think it's also important for audience members to know, like, you don't want to completely optimize your business. And I mean, I'm sure people are wondering, like, why? Why would you, why would you not want to completely optimize your business? Don't people want to look at a perfectly running machine? And the short answer is, and I think people need to look at themselves in a buyer's lens. If you in a general dentistry, if you had an 8 chair practice grossing 3.6 to 3.8, okay, and it was netting EBITDA of about $800,000, what is your upside in that business? It's a great cash flow business.
yeah.
It's doing great. It's got probably has great systems in it to allow that. It's probably repeatable, but is it going to command a premium valuation? Probably not, right? And I think that's important for people to digest that. So I always tell, our clients to kind of, when we get in there, let's get it to about a 80% marker, right? And allow a little bit of juice for the upside for the buyer to come in and work with you on, right? Because then it's a win-win for both sides. And those businesses tend to get a real meaningful valuation.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought that up because I don't think we mention that often enough. We talk about optimizing and getting your operations running as smoothly as possible, but what that means is still leave a little bit of room, right? There's no perfect scenario. And a buyer might come in and see some other opportunities that you don't see. And therein lies that space for improvement. So I'm glad you made that point. That's something that we don't mention often enough, that we're not looking for perfection, but most people that we run across, there are some things to iron out for sure that can definitely increase your value. So if I don't have the freedom I want, let's move on to how do we fix it? How do I create that? Like, let's start maybe with some steps to get there, knowing that everything you do is subject to the needs of the business, to make the business and the principal successful. So maybe we start with kind of a recipe. I was thinking in my mind about we can show you the meatloaf recipe, but the real magic's in the spices and things that you put in it, the little micro steps that make it so great. So from an advisor perspective, what are some things that people can do to start thinking about making that change? How do they create that freedom?
Yeah, so I think that there's two scenarios. One is, hey, if you jump in with both feet and completely replace yourself, right? And if you're a $1 million producer, you're effectively walking away from 300,000, but you're ho- probably in a very good way going to be able to bring on a good producing doctor that can, ideally and theoretically replace your clinical production, right? Because you can say, hey, here's my patient pool. I'm producing $1 million. I'm going to step out. You step in, right?
Mhm.
So that provides meaningful security for the associate doctor you're trying to recruit to say, whoa, I just get to walk into that schedule. Yep, you get to walk into that schedule. So I think that'd be the ideal theoretical way to do it. That said, I don't think that is feasible in most cases. And so the in most cases, what you're typically doing is starting to say, okay, how can I step my way through it? And remember, I used the example of going from 6 million to $9 million,
Mhm.
right, within that. So it also looks at the process of saying, okay, we have probably a few empty chairs within the business that allow us to grow from 6 million, $9 million, right? And open chair time within the business. We've talked previously about chair utilization and all those things. So, if you walk away from, let's say, 2 days a week, because you have to give some doctor at least 2 days a week at schedule,
Right.
okay? You're walking away from about $1,500 a day in income. So about $3,000 a week in income. So that's roughly around $150,000 in income. But in most cases, if you're grossing, $6 million, okay, in revenue, all you need to do is improve that EBITDA by 3%.
Mm.
Remember, you're at 15%,
Right.
and most of these businesses can run efficiently at 20%. If you can just get from 15% by being on the business to 18%, you made up your income loss.
Yeah.
I think it's very important for people to think about working on the businesses is much more efficient than working in the business if you have a desire to work on the business. So I think so that's probably step one, is to kind of take that step and kind of get to that margin and get to that, replacing yourself in income. And then concurrently, it's not one after the other, you're slowly also growing the business from 6 million to 6.5 million, working with all the doctors, your marketing team, your hygiene team, to eventually get it to $7 million. And in theoretically, if you maintain that margin at 7 million, you're actually making more money. And if you're being fiscally responsible and saving that excess cash, now you can backfill yourself with another associate, okay, and
Mm.
say, okay, now I can get that business backfilled and I can give up the extra 150,000. Now I'm trying to go from 7 million to 9 million, in production. And at 9 million, they're actually completely out of the chair clinically, and they are making the same as before, if not more, mathematically. Because remember, at 15%, they're about 1,250,000, 1,300,000. At 18%, they're probably going to be a lot more. And remember, we started at 750. So that's definitely more than the $300,000 in associate income they were making. Right. So I think there's a small tier steps for people to kind of think through. But the key being, like, if you have a passion to work on the business, you're a lot more efficient than in the business.
Yeah. And that's something that you kind of have to ask yourself initially. You have to decide that whether you want to be working in the business or on the business. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. Now, let's look at things like efficiency. If if we know that we are trying to create freedom, there are some things operationally that need to happen. So we have to get a lot more efficient. Like we said, not perfect. That's not what we're looking for here. But how do we get from a place of maybe things are disorganized with your two or three locations, or maybe even a few more locations than that? The way that your ops are set up, training, product spend, procurement opportunities, maybe your team could be a little bit leaner or at a minimum more efficient. Are your leaders leading or are you doing it all? So, from an operational perspective, how do you create that? I mean, I know working with someone to come in, an advisor to take a look at your business is part of it, but how do you see that from an operational perspective?
Yeah, so I'm big on following a process for RACI, and RACI stands for Responsible Accountant Consultant Informed, RACI, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of big corporations use it. We use it, amongst other processes. And I think what it does is allows us to, or allows a principal to kind of, look within. First of all, create an organizational chart. And if you don't have an organizational chart within your, as a, and you're listening to a podcast, I would highly encourage you to do it. Even if you're doing it on a blank piece of paper, your drawing skills are like me, which is like probably like a kindergarten, and still do it, because I think it just visually allows you to see your business.
Yeah.
And I think there's some level of satisfaction to visually see your business from your own hand, right? So I think it's important for people to visually see what the org structure looks like. And going back to the first thing we start talking about, Jamie, what have we built, right? Where are we, right? The question we talked about.
Yeah.
So
I
I
get
think that one is that, looking at the org chart, and then looking at the organizational chart and saying, okay, who in the organization was responsible for what, accountable for what, who is being consulted for which processes, and who's being informed for what processes.
Mhm.
And in most organizations, and I think, we've done podcasts on people, process, patient flow, right?
Right.
The process issues, what we're talking about with RACI, you know, people are spending 80% of their time firefighting because there's too many chefs in the kitchen or cooks in the kitchen, whatever the saying goes,
Yeah.
and a lot of people are cross pollinating roles and nothing is getting done. Okay. So, and I think that's what by having RACI within your organizational, it allows you to kind of say, okay, this is who's going to be doing what. This is how we're going to achieve those things. And now it allows us to now look forward in the organization, within 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and say, okay, this is who has to do this to achieve this target in 18 months. This is who has to do this to achieve this target in 9 months. And now we're starting to create this linear accountability process where we can look at each person and say, okay, that person in 12 months has to achieve that. And that also almost becomes like a performance review for them,
Yeah.
right? Because now and it actually aligns with the company's goals, right? So I think all those things start to connect the dots within an organization. But again, to me, fundamentally starts with one basic thing, you know, draw out your organizational chart and see who does what.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes once you've, sketched that out with your stick figures and got and have it in front of you, I think you can see if someone's maybe not achieving the things that you laid out for them, that you don't have the right people in the right seats. And that's not to say that they're out the door, but sometimes people end up fitting better where you don't expect, right? And then to take that a step further, you went exactly to the place with this I hope you would, and that was processes. And, everything's got a process. As a clinician, docs are not out there winging it on procedures. Just like in your business, you can't wing it and expect to have great outcomes. We don't even do that for this show. You and I talk about what we're going to talk about because we want the audience to receive resources and things that are of value. So, preparation has to touch every aspect of your business. And on that note, the last thing I want to ask you about is doctor development, because I don't think that you can create the type of freedom you want without proper doctor development. So let's talk a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, so I've touched a little bit earlier on, and I use sedation as an example, just as a unique process. But anytime you're trying to find independence, right? Financial freedom, business independence, independence from the practice. You also need to have doctor development. And doctor development comes in multiple ways within a practice. One way it comes in is actually clinically developing your doctors to provide better access to care. And we've had those conversations on the podcast of if your doctor's producing $800,000, or $600,000, what are we doing to support them to get to the next 20, 30% growth over the next 18, 24 months, right?
Yeah.
What are we doing to develop them to get there? How much time? And if it's a monthly call, that's probably not enough. Okay. So what are we doing to get there? That's one. But beyond that, I always encourage principals to maybe to spend that monthly call on show them how the business is run.
Yeah.
Okay, and I think a lot of principals sometimes are not comfortable sharing the books because they're going to see how much income is there and all this. And I think that's okay because you're taking the risks, and it's
Yeah.
important to say like, hey, here's how businesses are run. Here's how much cash reserves we need to have. This is why we do it, and let them understand how each micro decision within the practice affects the business. I think if you allow people to take ownership of the business, and I don't mean ownership in the sense of partnership, which we talked about earlier, just ownership of a responsibility of a role. I think you know, one if they understand it, they're going to do it. I
Right.
think a lot of doctors that are associates in practices don't like that aspect because they don't know. The majority of associates around the U.S. probably have never seen a profit and loss statement. Maybe they saw it in once in dental school. Maybe they saw it in a dental conference. And again, I'm completely speculating here, but beyond that, they don't know how a financial statement flows forward. Okay. And they haven't done a comparative analysis of Q1 over Q2 and see a business evolve on a good decision to a bad decision.
Right.
Okay. And I think those are things to just kind of spend time and do that. And then also develop them on how to lead a team. What it does it mean to come in at 7:30 or 7:25 when your office opens at 8? What does it do to the morale of the practice? How do you, drive positive decisions throughout the day, every single day? Because in most cases, beyond the practice manager who happens to be, one of the leaders in the practice, the doctors are also a monumental piece in driving the morale of the practice, you
100%.
know? So I think those are the components of doctor development to drive better outcomes.
Yeah, and then, we can take it down a different path of, you know, mentorship programs, clinical coaching programs like we offer here at Polaris have huge value in hearing how that impacts a business. I was talking with our clinical coach, Vivek Solanki, yesterday about some outcomes with a recent client and what that did for their entire team, let alone their numbers, which are amazing. But as a business, it changed them. There's skin in the game. When people see that kind of improvement, it's exciting. So, doctor development can mean a lot of things, and we can go down a number of paths with it, but watching the results of it can really add to your own personal freedom, which is what we're talking about. So, Dwalker, thank you for coming on the show today and talking about how to create personal freedom. I know that a lot of doctors struggle with that, and really just starting with where do you want to be? That old cheesy question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? But it's a legitimate question when it comes to your business. So, closing thoughts on creating personal freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say to everyone that either you're 12 months away from an exit, or not thinking about an exit, or 5 years away from of an exit. Find a path to the ability to. I said, um, if I haven't given people ideas for vacation south of France, it's supposed to be beautiful.
Yeah.
So it's on my bucket list. So that's why I keep talking about it over and over again. Like if you manifest your destiny, and that's what I'm trying to do here for all the podcast
Absolutely.
members. Um, but I think it's the ability to go on vacation, and I think and be able to enjoy life, and then also create systems so your team members can do the same thing. I think those two things I think are equally important. I would say that. Two, if you cannot exit your business or haven't thought about what that exit looks like, I think you're genuinely doing yourself a disservice because you're not building to a process, and that is a process in itself. I think a lot of people start evaluating that option when they've kind of, and we've said in the previous podcast, like when they're kind of done with their business, or when they kind of realize, okay, I'm at a good point, or when they see the market turn, or they see some regulation happen, or when they see something happen, it's a trigger event, and say, "Okay, now I'm there." And I
Yeah.
think that's not when you wanna do it. You wanna do it when life is good, when we even talked about it, Jamie, in a previous podcast, when you're actually passionate about your business,
Yes.
so I would encourage people to think about what that looks like, who their buyer profile is, and build towards their buyer profile. And lastly, connected to that, it's, a lot of audience member probably have completed a personal financial statement, recently, or when they applied for a mortgage. And, we all put our business as and our house on a personal financial statement, and say, okay, our house is worth $500,000 or $1 million. And, that's in our mindset. We might have looked at
Yeah.
Zillow or Redfin and kind of speculated what our house was worth.
Sure.
And then we actually go to sell it, and the house doesn't sell for that. So whatever we put on paper, it's paper. It's not the actual value. It's probably not what we can actually liquidate it for. You don't get to actually realize the economic value of your paper value until you execute on that decision. Okay. And, a lot of audience members here probably have 80 to 90% of their paper value in their business. Okay.
Yeah.
And I think it's
Right.
important for them to understand and consider, okay, how do they get access to that capital, you know, and liquidate that capital whenever they want, right? And if they chose to do it tomorrow, how soon does it happen?
Right.
And will it be the amount they think it is, right? Is it going to be the amount they put on their last personal financial statement? Right. And I think, again, those are things to just I'll leave audience members with, and is that, paper value is not the same thing as real value. So, we've said that we start with the end in mind, start thinking about, what you're building your business towards.
Wonderfully said. That's the kind of value that we really need to consider at the end of the day. To all of you, we love the questions that you send us, so keep them coming. We'll keep delivering the content that you ask for. As always, if you want to learn about any of our Polaris expert advisory services, or maybe there's a topic that we haven't covered that you'd like to hear about, you can send us an email to info@polarishealthcarepartners.com, and be sure to visit our website at polarishealthcarepartners.com, where you'll find weekly articles to grow and support your healthcare business, along with access to all podcast episodes, events, and a whole lot more. Thanks so much for being a loyal listener and subscriber. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a colleague and be sure to leave us a rating on any of your favorite podcast platforms. We'll see you on the next episode of the Group Practice Accelerator Podcast.